Hey guys, Spudknocker here, as always. And as you guys know, landing an aircraft is one of the hardest skills and yet one of the most fundamental skills a pilot needs to learn when learning how to operate their aircraft safely and effectively. This is true whether you're flying real aircraft like a Cessna 182, a Boeing 737, or even an F-A-18C in real life. The same applies to virtual aviators in DCS World or Microsoft Flight Simulator. So today I figured we'd hop back and go back to basics and hop into the cockpit of the F-A-18C Hornet and go over the absolute basic, most essential parts of landing the F-18 here in DCS World. Now this video will apply to all the aircraft in DCS World except for potentially the tail draggers. Now the reason we're using the F-A-18C for this demonstration is through some internal polling I've done in my Discord community. The vast majority of DCS World pilots own a couple of modules, but almost fly the F-A-18C exclusively. So let's go ahead and hop in the office and get started. Okay guys, welcome back to the office of the F-A-18C Hornet. Let's go ahead and get started with going over the very bare bones basics of landing here in DCS World. Like I said earlier, the reason why we're doing this demonstration in the F-A-18 is because the vast majority of you guys out there fly the F-A-18C almost exclusively, so I figured this would be a great aircraft for this demonstration here. Now the biggest issue that I see with a lot of new DCS World pilots that hop in and that I do one-on-one training with is they are very behind the aircraft. This means we need to make sure that you guys are staying in front of the aircraft and have a plan for everything you're going to do. So let's go ahead and pause the simulation here and come up with a plan of how we're going to execute our approach to Al Minhad Air Base before we actually fly through that approach. So let's go ahead and pause the simulation, open up the F10 map, and let's take a look at the map here. First thing we want to do, of course, is find out where exactly Al Minhad Air Base is. So it's right here on the map, so let's go ahead and zoom in on it. And it looks like a pretty typical military-style airbase, one long, skinny runway, with a long, skinny taxiway right off to the side of it with some smaller apron areas. Now here on the Persian Gulf map, pilots will get very confused between Al Minhad Air Base and Al Maktoum International Air Base over here. So, airport that is. And so the way we can easily tell the difference between the two is Al Maktoum International Airport over here does have a long skinny runway, but it's got a massive taxiway / apron area, and it's got massive terminals around it as well. As we can see, it's a lot closer to the water of the Persian Gulf than Al Minhad Air Base is. Of course, we can always pop in a waypoint on top of Al Minhad Air Base or pop in the TACAN frequency that is here at Al Minhad Air Base as well. But when you're new at DCS World, I really highly recommend choosing an airbase that has some pretty prominent visual landmarks, such as the Palm Islands here on the Persian Gulf map. And we can also think about the actual runway we need to land on, the runway number, what that means to us, and where the wind is coming from. We know via the weather report that the wind is going to be coming right down the pipe, right down the runway at a heading of 090, so we're going to land on runway 09. Now, a lot of new DCS World pilots who aren't really engrossed in the world of aviation don't realize that the runway numbers actually correspond to the headings of the runway. That'll be your heading when you're landing on that runway, and the heading you'll be taking off on that runway from. So runway 09 here corresponds to a heading of 090. And the reciprocal heading for the other runway facing the other direction is going to be 270 degrees. So keep that in mind in that when you're taking off going this direction or you're landing going this direction, your heading is going to be 270 degrees or due west. And if you're landing on this runway, runway 09, and you're coming down this way to land or coming down this way to take off, your heading is going to be 090, heading directly eastbound. I really like training new pilots on Al Minhad Air Base because it does have cardinal directions for the runway numbers and the corresponding runway headings. Makes it very easy to know where you are in the traffic pattern and whether or not you're lined up with the runway without having to do some esoteric math to figure out where exactly you are in relation to the course line coming off the runway. Next, let's go ahead and figure out how we're actually going to approach the airbase here. So we're coming down the coast of Dubai. We're going to fly past a whole bunch of really easy to use visual landmarks as we come over. We've got the World Islands, the Jumeirah Palm, and the unbuilt Palm Jebel Ali down here. And so a good way to get lined up for the runway here at Al Minhad, even because we're not being actively controlled by controllers, is to fly our aircraft all the way down to the Palm Jebel Ali to about the center point here. And then once we reach that Palm Island, we'll then turn left to a heading of 090 degrees, and we'll try to fly directly to the runway here. Because we're doing just a very basic overview of landing here in DCS World, we're just going to do a straight-in approach for landing. And when you are brand new in DCS or you're trying to go back to the basics and kind of remaster things, I highly recommend just doing a few straight-in approaches before you start doing brake turns and entering traffic patterns and these kinds of things. So because we're keeping it simple today, we're just going to do that straight-in approach. So we're going to fly this pretty much all visually, flying and using these landmarks to actually find our airport and land on the airport. And so we'll go ahead and hop back into the office now that we have our plan, and we're going to go ahead and execute that plan for the approach and landing. So let's go ahead and unpause it. And I'm also going to turn off the autopilot, the barometric altitude hold that I had, and I'm just going to start a gentle descent. Coming on down. And we can see the same visual landmarks that we wanted to use on the map right out here in front of us. This is why I really like using the Persian Gulf map for training us, because the visual landmarks are so easy to use. You know exactly where you are in this map at all times. We know that's Dubai, and that's Dubai International Airport right there. We've got the Strait of Hormuz behind us, and then bad guy country north of that when you cross and go feet dry over Iran. And then when you come back and you see this beautiful flat peninsula ringed by mountains on the eastern side, you know you're in good guy territory. Very easy to use for navigation purposes with new pilots. So we are roughly about 2.5 degrees nose down, and we're just going to continue a just nice and gentle descent coming on down towards the Palm Jebel Ali island before we make that left-hand turn to 090. One thing that I highly recommend is that you fly your aircraft gently. Use the autopilot to reduce your pilot workload. Fly the aircraft gently and smoothly. Don't be yanking that stick all around. Don't be slamming the throttle back and forth all around. And that will really help you. It's very easy to get behind the jet and kind of get lost as to what your jet is doing, what you need to be doing when you're kind of really rocking the jet around a lot, using a lot of full deflection on the stick, full up and down on the throttle, things like that. So let's go ahead and take ATC off, so that way you guys can see me use full manual stick control. And we'll go ahead and bring up the controls indicator down here. I'm also going to cut that out and repaste it up here in the top left in a bigger format, zoomed in format, so you guys can see that a little bit easier. And we'll go ahead and just continue this gentle descent coming on down towards the palm that we need to go to. Next, we'll go ahead and set up our cockpit and make sure we're ready for landing. We've got our master arm turned to the safe position. We've got our ALE 47 set to standby, so we're not going to accidentally FOD the runway by dropping chaff on it or anything like that. And we'll go ahead and bring up our HSI here on our left DDI, and we'll go ahead and go to our FCS page on our right side so we can see where our trim positions are and where our control surfaces are deflected very easily. And then down on the bottom here, we'll go ahead and go to our checklist. And we can see our aircraft weight down here as well. It looks like we're at a pretty good weight for landing. Just kind of have a pretty light loadout. We've got a couple empty fuel tanks, a couple little air-to-air missiles, a lightning pod on the centerline station, so it should be no big deal there. And as we come down towards about 5,000 feet, I'm just going to go ahead and level this off and do just a very gentle descent, bring the jet on down. As you're descending down to an airport for a landing, it's really important that you start your descent a little earlier rather than too late. If you're coming down at a very steep angle, coming down from like 25,000 feet with only 10 miles left to the airport of your intended destination, it's going to be really difficult. Similarly, if you start descending too far out and you get really low, that can be a little bit of a problem as well, but not nearly as big of a problem as trying to descend too steeply. Like I said, it's all about kind of finding that kind of nice middle ground of flying the aircraft nice and gently, precisely, and smoothly to make sure that you don't get behind the jet too far. So looking at those visual waypoints we talked about on the map, we can see we've got the Jumeirah Palm right there at the Atlantis Hotel on the end. Very easy to use landmark, and we're coming up on the Palm Jebel Ali. So we'll just make a gentle left-hand turn here, so that way we can get kind of towards the center of that island. And one of the big things when it comes to making your landings great here in DCS World is throttle control. Once you get slow enough in a fighter jet here in DCS World, or really even any aircraft, whether it's a 737, a 172, or an F-18, whether in Microsoft Flight Simulator, DCS, or in your real life, you get to a certain point called the region of reverse command, in which you slow down to a point where you have to increase your angle of attack to a point where you can maintain that altitude by increasing your lift via increasing that angle of attack. And that's going to require you to bring the power up to a higher setting. If you've taken any flight lessons, you'll know that as being kind of like slow flight. And you're kind of doing the slow flight down into a landing here in DCS World and in real life as well. And so we're going to start to use the power to increase or arrest our rate of descent while using our angle of attack to kind of change our airspeed. Now this is not quite as perfect and not quite as perfectly illustrated in a fighter jet in DCS World, but it is a definite occurrence that happens. And we can see there's Al Maktoum International right there, very close to the water. Very easy to make that mistake. And we'll start to gently bring our jet around towards a heading of 090 or due east. Trying to execute our plan that we came up with as perfectly as possible. We're kind of right over the center of the Palm Island, kind of where we wanted to be. Coming around through 090 degrees. And we'll go ahead and roll out on 090. Like I said, we're just flying the jet nice and gently, nice and easily. And we'll go ahead and push our waypoint up to waypoint 2 that we know is situated right on top of Al Minhad Air Base. We can see that it did come off to the left a little bit, so we probably lagged a little bit in our turn. Should have probably turned a little bit earlier, but it's an easy fix. And if we zoom in, we should see the airport way out there in front of us. And we can see the runway is a little bit off to our left, and if we drew a line directly off of the runway coming down towards us, we would be to the right-hand side of that line. The reason I'm not drawing a course line on my HSI for you guys is to show you guys that it can be done completely visually by trying to follow that plan that we came up with by looking at that F10 map. We just want to make sure we're lined up to the runway as far out as possible and that we're not too fast. As you guys can see, we've been flying through this entire demonstration at roughly about 300 knots, or a little bit above 300 knots. If you're new in DCS World, or you've just been having trouble with your landings, I recommend just flying the whole approach to the runway at a lower airspeed, so that way it's not too difficult to actually slow yourself down to landing speed and get to that runway. So as you guys can see on the controls indicator there, and if you're listening to the whine of our engines, I'm starting to slow the aircraft down by pulling the power back. And at this point, we're about 10 miles out from the runway. I'm going to go ahead and pop the speed brake out and get ourselves set up for landing. It's incredibly important to make sure you're lined up with the runway as far out as possible for a really nice straight-in approach to allow yourself to have a really good approach for that landing. So we're under 250 knots. I'm going to start to bring up the power just a hair. I'm going to drop the gear and drop the flaps. You can see our flaps are down to full, and we can see our gear is down and locked. At this point, we're going to start to feel a massive balloon from the extra lift from those flaps. And when I feel that massive balloon, I'm going to pull the power back. until we start to get down to around 140 knots. Now, as a general rule of thumb, this is not a perfect rule of thumb, but a general rule of thumb here in DCS World is that most of the fighter jets in DCS World like to be right at around 140 knots for landing. And as we start to get down to that 140 knots, that's when we're getting into that regional reverse command that we talked about a second ago, in which I now have to bring my power back up. You can see my throttles are back up towards the middle of the throw of travel of the throttles in the throttle quadrant. And now I'm going to go ahead and reduce my HUD brightness a little bit, so that way I don't lose the runway because it's blocked out by my symbology. And I'm just going to gently fly the aircraft nice and gently, trying to keep that 140 knots, bring in some nose-up trim to increase that angle of attack as I just fly the jet nice and gently down to the runway. And you can see my throttle movements are nice and gentle. If I need to bring that velocity vector up to the runway, instead of pulling back on the stick, I'm just increasing my throttle very gently, nice and slow, nice and gentle. Be patient. Patience is always key in DCS World and in any flight simulator you fly, and in a real airplane too, of course. Just coming in nice and slow, making gentle throttle adjustments. And you can see my throttle has never gone up to full power, and it has never come all the way down to idle. Very, very important. When people get into power oscillations, bring the throttle back and forth really, really quickly, that's where I see pilots start to get into that point where they start to drop like a rock and hit the ground way short of the runway, or go flying way past the runway. Had a little bit too much power there. We saw our velocity vector start to climb way up above that runway. Just bringing in just a hair, a little bit of nose-up trim. Nice and gentle with everything we're doing. Nice and slow, nice and gentle, nice and easy. If you find yourself really squeezing and white-knuckling your controls, your throttle and your stick, just ease off it. Fingertip pressure on everything. Relaxed muscles are fast and precise muscles. Tense muscles are slow and imprecise. So we're just keeping our velocity vector right on that touchdown point we want, and we're just making these gentle throttle movements all the way on down to the runway. And we can see our vertical velocity up there above our airspeed box is a little bit high for my taste, so as we come down to the runway, we're just going to increase our power just a little bit to arrest that descent rate. We're going to pull just back on the stick, just nice and gentle, start to reduce the power a little bit. Oh, got into a bit of a float situation there. And just a nice gentle there. Probably a little bit too much power on my part right at the end there, but it's better than slamming the aircraft right down onto the runway, and it's better than hitting that nose wheel on the runway. If you guys find yourself bouncing way up into the air after touching the runway with your wheels, it's probably because you're hitting that nose wheel first before the main wheels, and that in most aircraft will bounce you way up above the runway. And the F-18 is probably the most forgiving aircraft in DCS World to learn how to land, because it's got very strong landing gear with a very wide wheelbase, whereas the F-16 is probably one of the most difficult aircraft to land in DCS World. If you guys want me to fly through the same demonstration in either the F-16C or fly in the F-18 again but with a crosswind, please let me know in the comments below, and if you like the video, please give us a like and a subscribe. It is always very, very helpful. So now we're past the hold short line, and this is the end of our demonstration. As you guys saw, I did float a little bit too much there, got a little too much power right at the end, but it's better, like I said, than slamming the aircraft right into the ground. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, like I said, and fly safe out there and stay healthy, guys.